Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821, and his mother died in 1837 when he was 15, and his father died 2 years later. He wrote his first novel, called Poor Folk, in the mid-1840s, which got him plugged into what was going on in literary circles in St. Petersburg at the time. And in 1846, Alexei Plashchev, who was a poet, invited Dostoevsky to join a group of writers founded by Mikhail Petrushevsky, who was a proponent of social reform in Russia. Now, of this circle, one time Bakunin wrote in a letter to Alexander Herzen, who was seen as a predecessor to Russian socialism, that the group that Dostoevsky was in was, quote, the most innocent and harmless company, end quote, and that its members were, quote, systematic opponents of all revolutionary goals and means, end quote. So this initial group that Dostoevsky was in, at least according to Bakunin, writing to a friend in a private letter, maybe talked about society and proposed some reforms, but was very mild and did not advocate for revolution. They talked about freedom from censorship and the abolition of serfdom, which would still be close to 20 years off. Unfortunately, what Bakunin said did not apply to Nikolai Speshnev, who was an aristocrat who joined the circle in 1848 and began to create a secret revolutionary organization from among its members. Dostoevsky apparently joined that group, knew what it was trying to do, actively participated, and apparently even used a bit of his experience there in writing The Demons later. Eventually, members of the group were reported to the Russian Interior Ministry, and Dostoevsky was accused of reading banned works, including the Letter to Gogol by Vissarion Belinsky, and circulating copies of these works to others. The informant had said that at least one of the pieces of writing that he circulated had criticized Russian religion and politics, and Dostoevsky responded that he had read these writings purely for their literary value and was interested in, quote, personality and human egoism, end quote, rather than politics, though he was in a revolutionary political group at the time. And I would have liked to have learned more about this period in Dostoevsky's life because I'd be interested in the details here. What was this group planning? What was Dostoevsky's role in it? What was the evidence against him? Because the context here is that there had been a significant revolt in Russia in 1825, and the revolutions of 1848 were still rocking Europe, and so the Tsar would have been likely to respond with a heavy hand, and so Dostoevsky, knowing that it was possible that he would be executed, might choose to deny everything. The members of the circle were first held in the Peter and Paul fortress, which was well defended and housed the most dangerous criminals. They were later sentenced to death by firing squad, and on December 23, 1849, they were taken out, split into three-man groups, of which Dostoevsky was in the second group. And apparently at the last moment, though this was likely planned, a letter reached them commuting the sentence from execution to imprisonment. But Dostoevsky later, in the beginning of The Idiot, it's relatively early in The Idiot, the main character is imagining what it would be like to be sentenced to death, and it's very vivid. And I had read that section before I knew this bit about Dostoevsky, but he was drawing on this experience of facing execution. But the sentence was commuted, and he then spent 4 years in a prison camp in Siberia where, because he was classified as, quote, one of the most dangerous convicts, end quote, he reportedly had his hands and feet shackled for some amount of time while he was there, perhaps the whole time. The only book he had to read was the New Testament, though he was occasionally sent to the military hospital where they had newspapers and some Dickens novels that he could read. After the 4 years in prison, his sentence also involved 6 years of compulsory military service, which he apparently spent in Semipalatinsk, which is today in Kazakhstan. After that, he worked as a journalist. He published some small magazines of his own and a collection of his writings, and he traveled around Europe and developed a gambling addiction, the experience from which he drew on to write his novel, The Gambler. He eventually met Turgenev, but the two did not get along very well and they criticized each other's writings. In 1873, Dostoevsky printed The Demons himself under the Dostoyevsky Publishing Company, which he and his wife had founded. And they sold the book out of their apartment, and they only accepted cash, but they sold 3,000 copies of the book, so it was very successful. So if you are a self-published author and anybody snubs their nose at you, or if you ever look down on self-publishing, just remember that it was good enough for Dostoevsky, even toward the end of his career. And Fyodor Dostoevsky died in 1881 in St. Petersburg. One account said that there were about 40 or 50,000 people at the funeral, while another said that there were more like 100,000. But either way, his funeral was well attended. During his life, he wrote 13 novels, 3 novellas, 17 short stories, and many other works. He married twice, and he had 4 children by his second wife. When he was a kid, his parents read to him a lot, and he liked reading, and his nanny read to him also. And it was often fairy tales and sagas, but it also included more well-known writers as he got older, like Schiller and Goethe, but also Gogol, and the Russian writer Nikolai Karamzin, who wrote a very long history of the Russian state, which apparently has a kind of conservative angle and favors Russian independence. That is, political, cultural, economic independence from Western Europe. And before he was arrested in 1849, he reportedly said, quote, "As far as I am concerned, nothing was ever more ridiculous than the idea of a republican government in Russia," end quote. So that's a pretty conservative view. But then he also participated in this revolutionary political group. Though it sounds like that wasn't really what he was looking for at the time, but there was this social connection to this guy, and so he probably sort of got pulled into it. And in an edition of his diaries from 1881, which is the year of his death, he wrote, quote, "For the people, the Tsar is not an external power, not the power of some conqueror, but a power of all the people, an all-unifying power the people themselves desired," end quote. So somewhere before 1849, we have this anti-republican statement of his, at which time he would have had to have been in his 20s probably. And then we have this other statement in 1881 when he's 60, in which he's defending the position of the Tsar. He's saying this is what the Tsar ought to be. Maybe he's not defending the current Tsar. In fact, said in a certain tone that could be criticizing the current Tsar. But he's at least defending the institution of the Tsar, what the Tsar ought to be. He's not saying that the office should be dissolved. And of course, there are all kinds of adaptations of Dostoevsky's works. He's one of the most famous writers of all time. But I'm always interested in particular in the operas that have come out of the writings of a particular writer. And in Dostoevsky's case, there are 2 relatively well-known ones. One is The Gambler by Prokofiev and From the House of the Dead by Janacek. Notes from Underground is among the shorter works by Dostoevsky that are better known. And it's a very intense little book, and it's hard to even talk about in a general way because it's so personal. Because the narrator, the person who's talking, is sometimes saying things that we are all familiar with. But also, if I say what I feel about the narrator, which is that he sometimes goes to an extreme that I've never felt, it sounds kind of like self-praise. And what I'm talking about will make more sense as we get into it if you haven't already read it. And also there's a passage toward the end that we'll hopefully get to where he addresses the reader specifically on this point, on the reader saying that they don't identify with what the narrator is talking about. And one thing you notice relatively early about the book is that it's divided into 2 parts. The first part is more of an essay, and the second part is narrative. And this in a way reflects the narrator in particular, because he's a little bit neurotic, or maybe very neurotic. But also it reflects the subjective experience of life, which partially involves interaction with other people and with the world, and partially involves a person's inner world, their inner monologue, their thoughts. And this is the first Dostoevsky that I've ever read. I read Crime and Punishment in high school, but that doesn't really count. I'm sure we've talked about this on this podcast before, but I understand on the one hand why they assign books in high school, why they assign heavy books like Crime and Punishment in 1984. And it's probably at least for 2 reasons. One is that they're trying to equip young people with certain thoughts and certain modes of thinking, and to introduce those who are receptive to it to this world of books and thoughts that maybe not everybody will be interested in, but those who are will know that it's there and can pursue it further as adults. And the other reason is related to that they probably know that there are some people, many people, perhaps a sizable chunk of the population, who will read very few books, or at least very few books from what we call the canon, for the rest of their lives after high school. And so they want to cram in what they can at that time when it's required. So that's why they assign Dostoevsky in high school. And it's good. Maybe there are plenty of high schoolers who can get a lot out of it. But I find that what I get out of fiction is in part proportional to my life experience. That as I get older, I've experienced more things. And so when I read fiction, I can connect the types of characters and the types of behaviors there to things I've experienced. And so you can feel it more vividly and reflect on it. And of course, that's not the only value of fiction, to give you a medium by which to reflect on what you've experienced. Not even thinking about your own memories or the people you know specifically, but processing those elements in the abstract. That's not the only value that fiction provides. Another value that it provides specifically to young people, to people who have less experience, is a kind of synthetic experience. You're able to encounter certain types of people without having to encounter them. That if you're a smart young person, you can learn about the kinds of deceptions that people can do or whatever it might be without having to have met those people yourself, and thereby be better prepared when you do encounter them in real life. But anyway, this is all a footnote on how I read Crime and Punishment in high school, but I don't count that because I didn't get much out of it. But one of the things that I noticed, at least in this book, about Dostoevsky stylistically, is that he uses very long scenes of dialogue. The narrative doesn't hop around a lot. It's sitting in one place and then it moves to another place and it's sitting there. And I find that this is effective in giving you the feeling that you are sitting in the room, that you're there watching these people have this conversation. Whereas every time a story changes scenes, it jumps to another time or another place. That doesn't pull you out of the story. It doesn't quite remind you, oh, I'm reading a book. But it is a little blip in the connection that doesn't happen when a writer sits on one scene for a long time. And that was something I noticed in reading this book. But now we can get into some passages from Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In a short introduction, he explains that this book is fictional. Anybody picking it up doesn't need to worry that it's a real diary. Of course, now it's so well known that nobody would do that, but when it was first published, they might have. And he gives us a clue as to what he viewed this book as about a person who, though the writer of this particular book doesn't exist, somebody just like him could and almost certainly does, and that this is in some way an effect of society at that time. And there are certain things about the book that are a little dated, but most of it applies readily to today. And you could imagine somebody feeling in 2024 the way that the narrator of this story feels. Dostoevsky writes, quote, "The author of the diary and the diary itself are, of course, imaginary. Nevertheless, it is clear that such persons as the writer of these notes not only may, but positively must exist in our society, when we consider the circumstances in the midst of which our society is formed." Skipping ahead. In this fragment, entitled Underground, this person introduces himself and his views and, as it were, tries to explain the causes owing to which he has made his appearance and was bound to make his appearance in our midst. End quote. And in this next passage, the narrator is talking now. We're into the book. And he's talking about two types of people. He's talking about a more typical person who the narrator views as being a little dumb and strong. And then he talks about a different type of person who has a more acute consciousness. They're smarter, but they're weaker, and they view themselves as weaker. And it's still relatively early in the book, so you don't quite know this when you're reading this, but he's talking about himself when he talks about that weaker type of person. But there are a couple of interesting clues here about that psychology, and Dostoevsky is reflecting on this type of person. And first he points out that no one else asks this type of person to view themselves as a mouse. They just do it for some reason. They view themselves as weak, they view themselves as tread upon. But no one else asks them to do that in particular. People are just going about their lives. And this person puts themselves in a certain position that they don't even want to be in. And he also says that this kind of person is more spiteful. They always feel that they're insulted. And they're spiteful. They want revenge on the people who have insulted them. But they're likely to be more vicious in their revenge than a more ordinary person, because a more ordinary person, though they might take revenge for something, will trust in the justice of their revenge. Something was done to them, they give some retribution for it in their view, and now justice has been done. The account is settled. Whereas this mouse doesn't trust that their revenge has done the justice, and so they keep attacking. They're more vicious. The narrator, who is sometimes in literary discussion called The Underground Man, because he's a very interesting character, says, quote, "If you take, for instance, the antithesis of the normal man, that is, the man of acute consciousness, who has come, of course, not out of the lap of nature, but out of a retort. This is almost mysticism, gentlemen, but I suspect this too. This retort-made man is sometimes so nonplussed in the presence of his antithesis that with all his exaggerated consciousness he genuinely thinks of himself as a mouse and not a man. It may be an acutely conscious mouse, yet it is a mouse, while the other is a man, and therefore, etc., etc. And the worst of it is, he himself, his very own self, looks on himself as a mouse. No one asks him to do so, and that is an important point. Now let us look at this mouse in action. Let us suppose, for instance, that it feels insulted too, and it almost always does feel insulted, and wants to revenge itself too. There may even be a greater accumulation of spite in it than in the man of nature and truth. The base and nasty desire to vent that spite on its assailant rankles perhaps even more nastily in it than in the man of nature and truth. For through his innate stupidity, the latter looks upon his revenge as justice, pure and simple, while in consequence of his acute consciousness, the mouse does not believe in the justice of it." End quote. One of the things that makes this book so effective is that it really does read like, if not a journal, somebody's inner thoughts. The inner thoughts of a type of person, or the conversation rather. And he sometimes talks about his writing. Why am I writing this? Why am I writing it as if somebody's going to read it? I don't intend for anyone to read it. So there's some meta writing in it. But in passages like this next one, it's very easy to imagine that this person is sitting in front of you talking to you. And it's not only because he addresses the reader directly with some regularity. It's because you can imagine this kind of person. And in this next one, his nervousness is shown very clearly because you're reading along and he starts to say something about, "I bet you were thinking of this, but you're wrong and no such thing has ever happened. And I'm not that type of person. And so let's drop it, even though you're so interested in that." And when you're reading, you're going, "I wasn't thinking that at all." It's this restless, nervous, emotional energy that some people have, by which they sometimes inadvertently give away what's going on in their own heads when they don't mean to. And now that I'm thinking of it, there's a part later in the book, in the more narrative part of the book where there are characters talking to each other. There's a scene where a character does this. He more obviously spills what's going on inside of him when he doesn't mean to. And here it's a little bit more under control, but you can see the steam coming out of the pot even if you can't see the water boiling. The narrator says, quote, "But it is just in that cold, abominable half-despair, half-belief, in that conscious burying oneself alive for grief in the underworld for 40 years, in that acutely recognized and yet partly doubtful hopelessness of one's position, in that hell of unsatisfied desires turned inward, in that fever of oscillations, of resolutions determined forever and repented of again a minute later, that the savor of that strange enjoyment of which I have spoken lies. It is so subtle, so difficult of analysis, that persons who are a little limited, or even simply persons of strong nerves, will not understand a single atom of it. Possibly, you will add on your own account with a grin, people will not understand it either who have never received a slap in the face. And in that way you will politely hint to me that I, too, perhaps, have had the experience of a slap in the face in my life, and so I speak as one who knows. I bet that you are thinking that. But set your minds at rest, gentlemen, I have not received a slap in the face, though it is absolutely a matter of indifference to me what you may think about it. Possibly I even regret myself that I have given so few slaps in the face during my life. But enough. Not another word on that subject of such extreme interest to you." End quote. And this next passage and some other things that come up in Notes from Underground make me think that Nietzsche had read Dostoevsky. He certainly had, that's well known, but I mean that he was affected in particular by Notes from Underground and maybe by these passages, because there's some overlap. It's not exactly the same, but the thoughts are related. And here the narrator is talking about fact, about rejecting really soundly established reality. And of course, just last week we were talking about Heisenberg and subjectivism and the problems of the observer affecting the observed. And so, is there an ultimate truth? Is there ultimate reality? If there is it accessible? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, at a more surface level, when scientific facts come out, or arithmetic facts, as we'll see, the narrator here is saying that he's not under an obligation to accept them just because he's unable to knock them down. And there are parts of Nietzsche, how perhaps even the human interest in truth, the preference for what is true over what is untrue, is vulnerable to scrutiny. And that's not quite the same thing, but these are strange thoughts that don't come up a lot, and they were written in relatively close succession. Notes from Underground is 1864, and I don't remember where in Nietzsche he was talking about that, but he was writing in the 1870s and the 1880s, so it was certainly after this. But the narrator says, quote, "As soon as they prove to you, for instance, that you are descended from a monkey, then it is no use scowling, accept it for a fact. When they prove to you that in reality one drop of your own fat must be dearer to you than 100,000 of your fellow creatures, and that this conclusion is the final solution of all so-called virtues and duties and all such prejudices and fancies, then you just have to accept it. There's no help for it. For twice two is a law of mathematics. Just try refuting it. Upon my word, they will shout at you. It is no use protesting. It is a case of twice two makes four. Nature does not ask your permission. She has nothing to do with your wishes, and whether you like her laws or dislike them, you are bound to accept her as she is, and consequently all her conclusions. A wall, you see, is a wall, and so on and so on. Merciful heavens, but what do I care for the laws of nature and arithmetic when for some reason I dislike those laws and the fact that twice two makes four? Of course, I cannot break through the wall by battering my head against it if I really have not the strength to knock it down, but I'm not going to be reconciled to it simply because it is a stone wall and I have not the strength." End quote. I think another part of what makes this short book so effective is that it seems that Dostoevsky has tried very hard to imagine a certain kind of person and the sorts of things that that person would say, which obviously is something that's done a lot in fiction, that when a character speaks, it's not always the writer speaking through the sock puppet of the character. It's the writer trying to make that person say what they would say. And in this little book, there's actually two parts to it. First, we have this long monologue. For half the length of the book, approximately, it's just this guy talking. And if you were to read a full novel with a cast of characters, any one character would only get a few pages at a time throughout the book to give his piece, to say how he views the world. And here we can go really deep on this character because it's just him talking. But then we also get to see him interacting with other characters in the second part of the book. So that might be a little bit of insight into Dostoevsky's process in trying to imagine very deeply these characters and who they are, and then setting them forth, bouncing off of each other in the form of a narrative. But that background is all there. That very deep psychology is worked out in his mind. Maybe, hopefully, it seems like it is, even though only parts of it might come up in the novel. And it's worth noting that Notes from Underground was written before this period in which he wrote a lot of his best-known books. So he may have taken this as a template, not only some of the concepts that he talks about here, but the approach in developing a character. Maybe, I'm totally speculating, something that he used later to make his novels very rich. But I say all that because in this next passage, it's sometimes hard to tease out what this kind of neurotic character is saying and what Dostoevsky might have wanted to say. And the book is interesting in part because the narrator is a kind of anti-hero. We don't really want to emulate him. He seems kind of like a nervous wreck. I was finding that I sometimes wish I could tell him to just calm down. But at the same time, he does say some interesting things. We're not looking at him as a patient in a psych ward who needs help. We're looking at him as a thoughtful guy who's saying interesting things interspersed with some hang-ups. But in this next passage, he's talking about somebody who has a toothache moaning very extravagantly in order to get attention and to punish the people around him or something, and maybe to punish them for knowing that he is weak, which is a theme that comes up a few times in this story, that this very vulnerable person wants to punish the people who see his vulnerability. That comes up in the narrative. And interestingly, he says that the kind of person who does this is the European civilized man, the very modern man. And I think that there were plenty of people at that time who might have just suffered through a toothache, or they might have moaned in the normal way, not in the voluptuous way that he's talking about. But let me read the passage and you can see what you think about it. Quote, "I ask you, gentlemen, listen sometimes to the moans of an educated man of the 19th century suffering from toothache. On the second or third day of the attack, when he is beginning to moan not as he moaned on the first day, that is, not simply because he has toothache, not just as any coarse peasant, but as a man affected by progress in European civilization, a man who is divorced from the soil and the national elements, as they express it nowadays. His moans become nasty, disgustingly malignant, and go on for whole days and nights. And of course, he knows himself that he is doing himself no sort of good with his moans. He knows better than anyone that he is only lacerating and harassing himself and others for nothing. He knows that even the audience before whom he is making his efforts and his whole family listen to him with loathing, do not put a half-penny worth of faith in him, and inwardly understand that he might moan differently, more simply, without trills and flourishes, and that he is only amusing himself like that from ill humor, from malignancy. Well, in all these recognitions and disgraces, it is that there lies a voluptuous pleasure, as though he would say, I am worrying you, I am lacerating your hearts, I am keeping everyone in the house awake. Well, stay awake then, you too, feel every minute that I have toothache. I am not a hero to you now, as I tried to seem before, but simply a nasty person, an impostor. Well, so be it then, I'm very glad that you see through me. It is nasty for you to hear my despicable moans. Well, let it be nasty. Here I will let you have a nastier flourish in a minute. End quote. In this next passage, the narrator is talking about how he first made up things to be offended about. He would act as though he was offended about things that he was not really offended about out of boredom in order to feel that he is living in some way. And as you meet different kinds of people and you hear about different kinds of people, you come to realize that just about everybody is doing what they're doing to achieve some desired psychological state. They're trying to get their mind to a certain place. And that place might be the feeling that they have contributed in some way, or the feeling that they have conquered, or the feeling that someone has intruded upon them somehow, has offended them, or that they are the best or the most attractive, or that they are right in thinking that they are worthless. People somehow, in the course of their upbringing, or their experiences, or their genetic makeup, come to develop a preference for a certain kind of mental state. And the mental state also might be everything is fine, nothing is wrong. And this is somebody who, whatever news you bring them, they'll come up with a reason why it's not so bad, and in fact it's maybe a good thing. And I don't mean that in the Stoic sense, in which you notice the transience of everything and say this too shall pass, and so you don't make a big deal of something whether it's good or bad. I'm talking about somebody who minimizes bad news, not only about their personal lives, but about the world in general, in order to avoid what the world is. And I don't think we need to sit and magnify the way the world is, but we should acknowledge it as it is. But people come to prefer implies a kind of consciousness. I've been vacillating between the word addiction, which also came into my mind, and then I started to say prefer. What I'm thinking of is somewhere in between those two things. We might say a person inclines toward a certain mental state, but also everybody who is pursuing a particular mental state, for example, the feeling that lots of people are paying attention to them, that they are the center of attention. We all know people who have this preference. All of those people don't even go about it in the same way. First of all, men and women will go about that differently, but also not all women will go about it in the same way, and not all men will go about it in the same way. And let me read the passage now, and I'll say a bit more about it afterward. The narrator says, quote, "You will ask me, why did I worry myself with such antics? Answer, because it was very dull to sit with one's hands folded, and so one began cutting capers. That is really it. Observe yourselves more carefully, gentlemen. Then you will understand that it is so. I invented adventures for myself, and made up a life, so as at least to live in some way. How many times it has happened to me? Well, for instance, to take offense simply on purpose, for nothing. And one knows oneself, of course, that one is offended at nothing, that one is putting it on, but yet one brings oneself at last to the point of being really offended. All my life I have had an impulse to play such pranks, so that in the end I could not control it in myself." End quote. And in a way, all of us who are trying to get to a certain sensation, even if it's the feeling that you lived a full day, you did some good work on something that you believe in, that you think will contribute positively to the world, and now you're tired, and so you're going to sleep soundly. That is something that we pursue in part out of a desire for security and order. We're trying to make sense of this existence that we're in, of ourselves and of the world, and that's how we have come to do it. And somewhere along the way, we developed patterns of thinking and behavior that got us to hold that up as something worthwhile and something to strive for. And we can come up with a narrative about it, which is that it's mostly based on fact, and it's not contradicted by anything available, either morally or otherwise. But this is a mental structure comprising memes that we have built up in order to fend off this sense of insecurity that existence can give us, not social insecurity, but a deeper insecurity having to do with death and uncertainty. And it's also an answer to the problem of boredom, to the need for adventure. And adventure need not involve plane tickets and bombs going off. It can be the adventure composed of the sensations of our daily life. And I'm saying all this to point out that even if you feel that you can't really relate to the way that the narrator is talking about pretending to be offended about things that he's not offended about, many people, though not everybody, manage to avoid getting into that habit. You still do a version of what he's talking about, which is come up with adventures out of boredom, come up with a mental structure that gets you to a feeling that you want to have and lets you live your life and keeps you from being bored. And when you see somebody who is striving for attention or seems to take pleasure in stirring the pot, in causing problems between people, it's worthwhile to know that that person somehow came to have their mental life structured such that this is the way that they get their adventure. This is the way they get to that feeling that they want to have. And they're just unlucky enough to have it be based the way that it is, and you're unlucky enough to be around them. They also could have grown up differently to derive their satisfaction out of a sense of accomplishment, a sense of having done something in a high-quality way, a sense of having contributed to the community, whatever it might be. But their genetics and their minds and their environments wrote a different drama for them in which they are now playing their part. This next section is a little longer, but it's one of the main ideas in the book, and so I want to get into it. So I will stop at certain points as we go along. And there are a number of interesting side ideas that he talks about, but the main idea, he slow rolls it. It builds for a while. He doesn't say it right away, but he hints at it. So if you feel at a moment like you missed something, it's because he hasn't said the thing yet, but he'll say it a bit later. The narrator says, quote, "Tell me, who was it first announced? Who was it first proclaimed that man only does nasty things because he does not know his own interests, and that if he were enlightened, if his eyes were opened to his real normal interests, man would at once cease to do nasty things, would at once become good and noble, because, being enlightened and understanding his real advantage, he would see his own advantage in the good and nothing else, and we all know that not one man can consciously act against his own interests. Consequently, so to say, through necessity, he would begin doing good. Oh, the babe! Oh, the pure, innocent child! Why, in the first place, when in all these thousands of years has there been a time when man has acted only from his own interest? What is to be done with the millions of facts that bear witness that men consciously, that is, fully understanding their real interests, have left them in the background and have rushed headlong on another path to meet peril and danger, compelled to this course by nobody and by nothing, but, as it were, simply disliking the beaten track, and have obstinately, willfully struck out another difficult, absurd way, seeking it almost in the darkness." End quote. So he starts by talking about how we have this bad assumption that humans always act in their own interests, and that history testifies to that humans do not always act in their own interests. Not only because they do foolish things, but they deliberately and consciously act against their own interests for a specific reason that he doesn't say yet. Continuing on, quote, "So I suppose this obstinacy and perversity were pleasanter to them than any advantage. Advantage. What is advantage? And will you take it upon yourself to define with perfect accuracy in what the advantage of man consists? And what if it so happens that a man's advantage sometimes not only may, but even must, consist in his desiring in certain cases what is harmful to himself and not advantageous? And if so, if there can be such a case, the whole principle falls into dust. What do you think? Are there such cases? You laugh. Laugh away, gentlemen, but only answer me. Have man's advantages been reckoned up with perfect certainty? Are there not some which not only have not been included, but cannot possibly be included under any classification? You see, you gentlemen have, to the best of my knowledge, taken your whole register of human advantages from the averages of statistical figures and political economical formulas. Your advantages are prosperity, wealth, freedom, peace, and so on and so on. So that the man who should, for instance, go openly and knowingly in opposition to all that list would, to your thinking, and indeed mine too, of course, be an obscurantist or an absolute madman. Would he not? But you know, this is what is surprising. Why does it so happen that all these statisticians, sages, and lovers of humanity, when they reckon up human advantages, invariably leave out one? They don't even take it into their reckoning in the form in which it should be taken, and the whole reckoning depends upon that. It would be no greater matter. They would simply have to take it, this advantage, and add it to the list. But the trouble is that this strange advantage does not fall under any classification and is not in place in any list. End quote. And that's sort of what I was talking about before. He hints at this other advantage, this reason why man would go against all of his advantages, but he doesn't say it yet. Continuing on, quote, I have a friend, for instance. Gentlemen, but of course he is your friend too, and indeed there is no one to whom he is not a friend. When he prepares for any undertaking, this gentleman immediately explains to you, elegantly and clearly, exactly how he must act in accordance with the laws of reason and truth. What is more, he will talk to you with excitement and passion of the true normal interests of man. With irony, he will upbraid the short-sighted fools who do not understand their own interests, nor the true significance of virtue, and within a quarter of an hour, without any sudden outside provocation, but simply through something inside him which is stronger than all his interests, he will go off on quite a different tack. That is, act in direct opposition to what he has just been saying about himself, in opposition to the laws of reason, in opposition to his own advantage, in fact, in opposition to everything. I warn you that my friend is a compound personality, and therefore it is difficult to blame him as an individual. The fact is, gentlemen, it seems there must really exist something that is dearer to almost every man than his greatest advantages, or, not to be illogical, there is a most advantageous advantage, the very one omitted of which we spoke just now, which is more important and more advantageous than all other advantages, for the sake of which a man, if necessary, is ready to act in opposition to all laws, that is, in opposition to reason, honor, peace, prosperity, in fact, in opposition to all those excellent and useful things, if only he can attain that fundamental, most advantageous advantage which is dearer to him than all. Yes, but it's advantage all the same, you will retort. But excuse me, I'll make the point clear, and it is not a case of playing upon words. What matters is that this advantage is remarkable from the very fact that it breaks down all our classifications and continually shatters every system constructed by lovers of mankind for the benefit of mankind. In fact, it upsets everything. But before I mention this advantage to you, I want to compromise myself personally, and therefore I boldly declare that all these fine systems, all these theories for explaining to mankind their real normal interests, in order that inevitably striving to pursue these interests they may at once become good and noble, are, in my opinion, so far, mere logical exercises. Yes, logical exercises. End quote. And we're going to keep going, but in this next section he mentions Buckle, and that's a reference to Henry Thomas Buckle, who's an English historian who talks about the thing that he mentions. Continuing on, quote, why, to maintain this theory of the regeneration of mankind by means of the pursuit of his own advantage is, to my mind, almost the same thing as to affirm, for instance, following Buckle, that through civilization mankind becomes softer and consequently less bloodthirsty and less fitted for warfare. Logically, it does seem to follow from his arguments. But man has such a predilection for systems and abstract deductions that he is ready to distort the truth intentionally. He is ready to deny the evidence of his senses only to justify his logic. And in this next section, he mentions Schleswig-Holstein, which is a region of what is today Germany, but at the time it was disputed and there was fighting over it. This is something that we looked at in the episode on Theodor Storm. If you're curious about that topic, I encourage you to go and listen to that. And remember, this book was published in 1864, so maybe he's writing in 1863 or 1862 even. He's writing around that time, which is smack in the middle of the American Civil War. And in this next passage, he refers to North America sarcastically as the Eternal Union for that reason. Continuing on, quote, I take this example because it is the most glaring instance of it. Only look about you. Blood is being spilt in streams and in the merriest way as though it were champagne. Take the whole of the 19th century in which Buckle lived. Take Napoleon, the great and also the present one. Take North America, the Eternal Union. Take the farce of Schleswig-Holstein. And what is it that civilization softens in us? The only gain of civilization for mankind is the greater capacity for variety of sensations, and absolutely nothing more. And through the development of this many-sidedness, man may come to finding enjoyment in bloodshed. In fact, this has already happened to him. End quote. And in this next passage, he mentions Stenka Razin, who was a Cossack leader of an uprising against the Tsar in what we would today call Central Asia in 1670 and 1671. And apparently, among other things, he was known for his massacres. Continuing on, Quote, "Have you noticed that it is the most civilized gentlemen who have been the subtlest slaughterers, to whom the Attilas and Stenka Razins could not hold a candle? And if they are not so conspicuous as the Attilas and Stenka Razins, it is simply because they are so often met with, are so ordinary, and have become so familiar to us. In any case, civilization has made mankind, if not more bloodthirsty, at least more vilely, more loathsomely bloodthirsty. In old days he saw justice in bloodshed, and with his conscience at peace exterminated those he thought proper. Now we do think bloodshed abominable, and yet we engage in this abomination, and with more energy than ever. Which is worse? Decide for yourselves. They say that Cleopatra, excuse an instance from Roman history, was fond of sticking gold pins into her slave girls' breasts and derived gratification from their screams and writhings. You will say that that was in the comparatively barbarous times, that these are barbarous times too, because also, comparatively speaking, pins are stuck in even now, that though man has now learned to see more clearly than in barbarous ages, he is still far from having learnt to act as reason and science would dictate. But yet you are fully convinced that he will be sure to learn when he gets rid of certain old bad habits, and when common sense and science have completely re-educated human nature and turned it in a normal direction. You are confident that then man will cease from intentional error and will, so to say, be compelled not to want to set his will against his normal interests. That is not all. Then, you say, science itself will teach man, though to my mind it's a superfluous luxury, that he never has really had any caprice or will of his own, and that he himself is something of the nature of a piano key, or the stop of an organ, and that there are, besides, things called the laws of nature, so that everything he does is not done by his willing it, but is done of itself by the laws of nature. Consequently, we have only to discover these laws of nature, and man will no longer have to answer for his actions, and life will become exceedingly easy for him. All human actions will then, of course, be tabulated according to these laws mathematically, like tables of logarithms up to 108,000 and entered in an index. Or better still, there would be published certain edifying works of the nature of encyclopedic lexicons in which everything will be so clearly calculated and explained that there will be no more incidents or adventures in the world. Then, this is all what you say. New economic relations will be established, all ready-made and worked out with mathematical exactitude, so that every possible question will vanish in the twinkling of an eye, simply because every possible answer to it will be provided. Then the palace of crystal will be built. Then, in fact, those will be halcyon days. Of course, there is no guaranteeing, this is my comment, that it will not be, for instance, frightfully dull then. For what will one have to do when everything will be calculated and tabulated? But on the other hand, everything will be extraordinarily rational. Of course, boredom may lead you to anything. It is boredom sets one sticking golden pins into people, but all that would not matter. What is bad, this is my comment again, is that I dare say people will be thankful for the gold pins then. Man is stupid, you know, phenomenally stupid. Or rather, he is not at all stupid, but he is so ungrateful that you could not find another like him in all creation. I, for instance, would not be in the least surprised if all of a sudden, apropos of nothing, in the midst of general prosperity, a gentleman with an ignoble, or rather with a reactionary and ironical countenance were to arise and, putting his arms akimbo, say to us all, "I say, gentlemen, hadn't we better kick over the whole show and scatter rationalism to the winds, simply to send these logarithms to the devil, and to enable us to live once more at our own sweet foolish will?" That again would not matter, but what is annoying is that he would be sure to find followers. Such is the nature of man. And all that for the most foolish reason, which one would think was hardly worth mentioning. That is, that man everywhere, and at all times, whoever he may be, has preferred to act as he chose and not in the least as his reason and advantage dictated. And one may choose what is contrary to one's own interests, and sometimes one positively ought. That is my idea. One's own free unfettered choice, one's own caprice, however wild it may be, one's own fancy worked up at times to frenzy, is that very most advantageous advantage which we have overlooked, which comes under no classification, and against which all systems and theories are continually being shattered to atoms. And how do these wiseacres know that a man wants a normal, virtuous choice? What has made them conceive that man must want a rationally advantageous choice? What man wants is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost and wherever it may lead. And choice, of course, the devil only knows what choice. End quote. And that is the end of that long section about human behavior and human motivation. And he's trying to get to the bottom of why people do what they do. And as you get older and you hear about different people and you meet different people, you come to realize that this view that Dostoevsky mentions, and now I'm understanding why he says, who knows who first articulated it, because first I was going to call it liberal, not in the liberal conservative modern sense, but in a sense of over the past 200 years, sort of the way things have been going, somehow characterizing a larger view of the world. And then I was going to call it enlightenment, but it also seems that it's older than that too. You could certainly find ancient Greeks who articulate this view, but the view generally is the idea that the reason for the problems in the world is ignorance. That if people had enough knowledge, and if they knew what was good for them, then these bad things wouldn't happen. And so then the overall cultural project, nominally, and for some people sincerely, is to accumulate and disseminate knowledge so that we can get rid of the ignorance and by extension, get rid of the strife that comes from the ignorance. And even as somebody who places a very high value on knowledge and learning, I'm increasingly seeing that this is not the case. You can have very educated people who have everything that they need available to them, causing problems for totally different reasons. Empirical knowledge that's testable, verifiable, falsifiable, replicable, is less conducive to, for example, sectarian war, because if everybody agrees on the premise that what can be demonstrated must be what is true, then it's much less likely that two large groups of people can come to very different conclusions. The trouble is that that's not true of something like revelation. That if you're saying my knowledge is based on something that's not sensible, meaning it cannot be sensed, it's something that's inaccessible to the senses, then you can have somebody else saying, my knowledge is that way also, except it's the opposite. And those people can't reconcile, and if they disagree enough, they'll eventually start killing each other. So empirical knowledge conduces peace to a certain extent. And if you were to have a foundation or a government ministry, the task of which was to both teach the public how to evaluate information in this way, how to be skeptical, and to seek evidence in proportion to claims, and not only to do that, but to esteem this as a value. For this practice and this view to have prestige, that would probably limit certain kinds of social strife. And it would also make it so, as we were talking about earlier, more people would have a mental framework that gave them a good feeling by doing something useful for the community and for themselves. That is by evaluating and scrutinizing competing claims and coming to conclusions. But all this would be moving toward the crystal palace that Dostoevsky talks about here, this utopia or dystopia of the future in which everything is mathematically tabulated and everyone is required to do what is most perfectly rational or expected to do that. And this crystal palace would be prioritizing all of the advantages that he says that people usually think of when they think of advantages, well-being and health and so on. And it takes him a while to get to it, but he points out that the advantage, the most advantageous advantage, is a human's independence, is their ability to make their own choice even against their other advantages. And sometimes they want this even more than they want rationalism. And he doesn't quite say this, but I think he would agree that people want to feel perhaps at any cost that this is always an option for them, even if they don't always deploy it. If people felt that they were obligated all the time to make the rational decision, that they were forced to do so from the outside somehow, not because of an inner sense of obligation to community or to their children or their family or something else to which they feel a very close proximity, but by something foreign, something more socially distant, most people would rebel against that. If not immediately, then over time. And he says that part of what we might call the Crystal Palace ideology, the worldview that claims to be or thinks that it is moving toward the Crystal Palace. And this criticism is interesting because it's not sectarian. You couldn't point to a single political party or group that has this view today. This is a very broad idea. It's an unspoken assumption behind a lot of our views about science and knowledge and strife in the world. Many people are Crystal Palace ideologues, even if they don't realize it. But part of that ideology, and he touches on this, is that anyway, humans never had their own will. They were a kind of a piano key or an organ stop that you were being activated by other things in your environment. And so now to be activated instead by reason is the reasonable thing to do. But then he makes some arguments against this. He says there would be no more adventure. It would be frightfully dull. There would be so much boredom that people would be thankful for the gold pins. They would wish that somebody was torturing them in some way, just so that they had some adventure. And he says that some guy would come along and say, let's kick the whole thing over, and other people would join him. And on the one hand, Dostoevsky seems to oppose that figure, but he also does not seem to be a total proponent of the Crystal Palace. Where do you think you would fall there? Would you be a Crystal Palace loyalist or a throw rationalism to the wind rebel? For me, the problem I have with imagining the Crystal Palace future is that the assumption is that it would be some kind of idealized perfection of optimizing human advantages, that it would get us everything that we need in the most efficient way. And under an ideal condition, if you had a state that was truly subservient to its nation, that was answerable to it, responsible for it, serving its well-being, and really operating in its best interest, to create a situation in which gains are maximized and harm is minimized, and gains and harms are defined in a way that the nation agrees on, and everyone is consenting to be governed in this way. Under that condition, there might be an argument to have over the Crystal Palace. The trouble is, it is very difficult to imagine the social and political circumstances under which that could happen. I won't say it's impossible, but I wouldn't trust any political system anywhere in the world today to do it, so I'm skeptical. And I even share this desire to use math and the science that's available to us to try to optimize politics and sociology in this way. Not as an end of life, not so that we can all be perfectly comfortable and have every sharp edge blunted so that we never get hurt in any way ever, but as a background against which we could do other things. The trouble is that real political systems are by definition never ideal, and they can be subverted to the interests of the people who control them. And also this whole passage asks a big question about what humanity is doing overall. And this also reminds me of Nietzsche. There's some line in Nietzsche somewhere where he talks about how it's very clear what any individual's goal is, or it's superficially clear. But what's not clear is what the goal of humanity as a whole is. And I don't remember if he uses the image of bees buzzing around a hive, or if that's an image that came into my head. But the point is that the aggregate goal of humanity is not clear. And that's worth thinking about, because if the goal is the Crystal Palace, so that everybody's perfectly comfortable and has everything that they need and is very bored, and eventually we just kick it over and try to get back to where we are now, then that's not much of a goal. Then we are just, even at the aggregate level, buzzing around in circles. And so then the question is, if that isn't the goal, then what is? He says, quote, "And one may choose what is contrary to one's own interests, and sometimes one positively ought," end quote. That sometimes the most advantageous thing is to be irrational, to discard all of your so-called advantages and assert your free choice. And just to highlight where he finally says what he's saying, he writes, quote, "One's own free unfettered choice, one's own caprice, however wild it may be, one's own fancy worked up at times to frenzy, is that very most advantageous advantage, which we have overlooked, which comes under no classification and against which all systems and theories are continually being shattered to atoms," end quote. And that wasn't even a third of what I wanted to show you from this book. It's a very interesting short little book, but I'll wrap it up with a couple thoughts. One is that we've been looking at this whole passage here as though Dostoevsky were laying out what he thinks. And he's not even completely clear about which side he comes down on, but we get a lot of what he's talking about. But we can't forget that the person who is saying this is this character, this underground man, the narrator, who at other times, as you'll see in the book, has some very serious, what we might today call social anxiety. So are we to interpret this passage of Dostoevsky as his own thoughts, that he's sliding into this book portraying this type of person? Or is it a symptom of this guy? And by the way, I know I've been looking down my nose at this character a little bit, but let me just show you how the joke's on me or on any reader who reads the book in that way. And this isn't giving anything away. In fact, if you haven't read this book and you go and read it, knowing that this is toward the end might make you read the book more carefully and more effectively. Dostoevsky writes, quote, "Hadn't I better end my notes here? I believe I made a mistake in beginning to write them. Anyway, I have felt ashamed all the time I've been writing this story, so it's hardly literature so much as a corrective punishment. Why, to tell long stories showing how I have spoiled my life through morally rotting in my corner, through lack of fitting environment, through divorce from real life, and rankling spite in my underground world, would certainly not be interesting. A novel needs a hero, and all the traits for an anti-hero are expressly gathered together here. And what matters most It all produces an unpleasant impression, for we are all divorced from life. We are all cripples, every one of us, more or less. We are so divorced from it that we feel at once a sort of loathing for real life, and so cannot bear to be reminded of it. Why, we have come almost to looking upon real life as an effort, almost as hard work, and we are all privately agreed that it is better in books. And why do we fuss and fume sometimes? Why are we perverse and ask for something else? We don't know what ourselves. It would be the worse for us if our petulant prayers were answered. Come, try, give any one of us, for instance, a little more independence, untie our hands, widen the spheres of our activity, relax the control, and yes, I assure you, we should be begging to be under control again at once. I know that you will very likely be angry with me for that, and will begin shouting and stamping. Speak for yourself, you will say, and for your miseries in your underground holes, and don't dare to say all of us. Excuse me, gentlemen, I am not justifying myself with that all of us. As for what concerns me in particular, I have only in my life carried to an extreme what you have not dared to carry halfway. And what's more, you have taken your cowardice for good sense and have found comfort in deceiving yourselves, so that perhaps, after all, there is more life in me than in you. Look into it more carefully. Why, we don't even know what living means now, what it is and what it is called. Leave us alone without books and we shall be lost and in confusion at once. We shall not know what to join on to, what to cling to, what to love and what to hate, what to respect and what to despise. We are oppressed at being men, men with a real individual body and blood. We are ashamed of it. We think it a disgrace and try to contrive to be some sort of impossible generalized man. We are stillborn, and for generations past have been begotten not by living fathers, and that suits us better and better. We are developing a taste for it. Soon we shall contrive to be born somehow from an idea. But enough. I don't want to write more from underground. End quote. So he says he has taken to an extreme what most people won't carry halfway. That he's exaggerated certain things that are in everybody, and that we disguise our cowardice as good sense and are comforted in our self-deception. Unfortunately, I have to leave it there. So thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you will send it to a friend who you think will enjoy it as well. And go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com, and pick up some books for yourself there. I only have one right now, but hopefully I'll have more in the future. And do your part to support independent book publishing, something that I believe in, not because I do it, but I do it because I believe in it. This is a profession by very deliberate choice for me. So I hope you'll go over there and enrich your library and those of the people that you care about. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.